This is part 3 of the FEMA Pre-Disaster Mitigation Grant Program Advanced Assistance webinar. Presenters are Brenna Humphrey and Stephen Randolph with FEMA Region 10.
So, advanced assistance can be used for project application development as well as project scoping, and in fact, there are theoretically advanced assistance sub-applications that could incorporate both. You could literally have a pretty darn good idea about what you want to do, but you need that project scoping funding to hire the engineer to do the feasibility analysis and do the community engagement process to make sure that's what the community wants to do, and then immediately move into your project application development. So how can advanced assistance help with project development? Well, like all of those other things that we talked about under project scoping, it enables you to have funding to hire staff or contractual resources for fully developing your hazard mitigation project and sub-application, identified from prior project scoping, scopes of work, work schedules, cost estimates, benefit cost analysis, environmental historic preservation, the whole shebang. You can identify and coordinate cost share, pay for engineering conceptual design, or more advanced design work that is necessary for completion of EHP review. Remember, for national technical review, you just have to have the engineering conceptual design. But if you have identified in your project scoping and in your application development that there's going to be extensive environmental review involved with your proposed project, then you need to go ahead, if you possibly can, and do the design work necessary to get to the point where the EHP review and consultation with the other federal and state and tribal agencies, particularly for fish and wildlife issues, and Clean Water Act issues, that can occur readily after a project is selected. So this allows you to help front load your own project review, i.e. make it happen faster. Faster time, shorter time period between when the project is selected for further review and when you actually get an award. That can be done here in advanced assistance. This is super critical to know, because probably the biggest single complaint we hear from communities and tribes is, why does it take so long to get the project from selection to award? And usually it has to do with the fact that there was not much environmental documentation development, and we have to do a lot of work on the environmental review. So advanced assistance also allows you to incorporate green infrastructure concepts into all kinds of projects. I've noted here even adding green infrastructure projects to activities such as seismic retrofits or elevation projects. In another webinar, we talked about that some more, but I'm going to explain what that is. You're doing a seismic retrofit of a fire station, okay? There's no reason that you can't also include a green wall, a green roof. You could incorporate permeable paving in the non-fire truck part of the paved area, like for when people come to visit the fire hall. You can shade that parking lot. You can put in a rain garden or a larger bioswale to take the runoff from the roof of the fire station, or even better, the runoff from the very large impervious paved area, so that you can do the stormwater treatment, water quality treatment, and contain the stormwater on site before it goes into either the aquifer or on into the stream system. So those kinds of things can be included in a project. These are things that I don't think many people have ever thought about, didn't even know FEMA would fund. But yes, that's the value of ecosystem services benefits that go into a benefit cost analysis. Okay, benefit cost analysis, that's usually a huge issue. Developing the historic damage data, documentation for every data point for which a FEMA default value is not going to be used. There's this crazy module we have called the damage frequency analysis module. Literally, the better documented data that you can put into that, the more certain you are to pass national technical review. So that's super, super critical. Also, sometimes it really takes an expert to understand how to incorporate ecosystem services benefits into a project. Development of the environmental historic preservation documentation. Hey, this includes contracting for a biological assessment, phase 1, phase 2, phase 3 site analysis. If you suspect there's hazardous waste issues involved. There's the possibility that even for probably a fairly small project, or at least a small environmental assessment, you could fund the environmental assessment itself prior to project submittal through Advanced Assistance by coordinating your work with our FEMA regional environmental officers so that that EA is done to our specifications and is literally ready to be turned over to FEMA with the sub-application to expedite the environmental review process that occurs after a project is selected. So these are some really golden opportunities here. Again, community engagement. We can't emphasize this enough. The funding can be used, I mean, you can literally hire contractors that are totally separate from project development to just be community facilitators and try and work with the community. In the project scoping, it's absolutely critical to get out there early. Oftentimes your community can tell you about things you're not even aware are really important to them. I've heard this over and over again in recent presentations I've listened to in various workshops over the last couple of years, is that they started the community engagement process early, and actually it truly informed the selection of the projects that they made. So the common application elements, the next step. So in a project application, you need the authorized agent, the commitment on the part of the tribal governing body to commit to the match that's required for a project, to apply for the grant, to accept the grant award, all of those things that go on behind the scene having to do with the grant itself. Development of the scope of work in all the various elements of that. Project scheduling, the cost estimate and budget, the benefit cost analysis, environmental historic preservation information, technical feasibility, I forgot to include on this, and actually filling out the grant application form. All of this can be funded under Advanced Assistance. So the project scope, I'm going to repeat some slides here. I'm going to go over this fairly quickly because this was what we covered 2 weeks ago on our project application webinar. But basically, it's the who, what, when, where, and how of what is proposed to do. Engineering report and conceptual design is absolutely critical in order to get your project through National Technical Review. If there is not an engineering report and concept and you just say, hey, we need to upgrade the culverts, it's not going to happen. Advanced Assistance pays you to pay that engineer to get that report and to get that conceptual design so that that engineer's peers on the National Technical Review can review it and say, hey, this is a feasible project, or it looks like it could be a feasible project. I included this slide because it's so important that your supporting documentation to support the project, you can develop it, you can gather it all together, you can extract information, put it in PDFs, create file structures as part of the Advanced Assistance Award. The work schedule, we talked about that. That is, again, something that is normally the outgrowth of an engineer's conceptual design and report. But let's say you're doing buyouts or you're doing flood elevations. Those don't require engineer designs. They don't require engineering reports. It's nice to have an engineering evaluation, like Brenna said, of if they're older structures that are proposed to be elevated, are they actually feasible to be elevated? That's great to include, and it's really important as you're scoping your project, because you could say, well, we're not going to try to elevate that particular house, but we'll do something else for that house. So again, this is the work schedule is an outcome. The community, it's actually oftentimes an outcome of your whole project scoping, because you'll realize that various things have to happen at certain times. For example, in our part of the world, in Alaska, there are severe season limitations, construction windows. In the rest of the Pacific Northwest, if you're doing in-stream work, there are definitely fish windows that have to be adhered to. In other words, most of the year you can't actually do construction in the water because of endangered species going and coming up and down the streams or the like. There's also, I have recently learned, well, not recently learned, I learned this very explicitly from one of our Kittitas County projects here in Washington State. The severe limitations placed on doing wildfire mitigation has to occur after the end of the winter so that it doesn't compact the soil that's wet as the snow melts, and it can't be done after the wildfire season starts. And we throw something else in, another construction window. It can't be done during migratory bird nesting season if there's those bird species are covered by the Migratory Bird Act. So there's a lot of stuff that goes on in there. You'll find out about those things if you do your environmental documentation well, and this is part of the project. Again, projected time must not exceed the grant performance period. That's 4 years from selection for critical infrastructure, resilient infrastructure projects, the big daddies, so to speak, or Big Mama in the case of Bertha, the tunneling machine that went under Seattle, and for the regular projects which have a $4 million Fed share. Again, these are federal share caps. That $10 million project could actually be a $30 million project. You're just asking for $10 million of FEMA money to go into it, Fed money. But again, your projected time schedule cannot exceed 4 years after the selection date, or 3 years for the regular projects that have a $4 million Fed share cap. That doesn't mean that your project is going to be stopped if you hit that 4-year or 3-year period of performance and you're not finished yet. There's always the opportunities for extensions. But you have, what FEMA is asking is that you try to make sure that what you're proposing to do can realistically be done within that proposed scope of work. I mean, within that within the period of performance that applies to that particular grant funding cycle. Congress expects us to do this. That's why we're doing this. Doesn't mean that we can't work with you if the schedule slips, okay? Cost estimate and budget, engineers that are helping you on a seismic retrofit or an infrastructure project or a stormwater management project, they're going to help you a lot with this. That typically cost estimation is included as part of their report, and they will, because it's coming from an engineer who has expertise in these kinds of projects, that's accepted as subject matter expert documentation. But for flood elevations and for buyouts, you have to come up with your own cost estimate. And as Brenna was sharing with you, make sure you include all the costs. I think something that most tribes and local governments forget to include in their budgets is their own staff time working on the projects. Well, you said, well, that's our match. Well, you know what? If you don't put it in the budget, you can't use it as match. Because the budget tells you this is the 100% project, we're funding 90 at the Fed share and 10 at the local, or we're funding 75 and 25, but it's based on what you put into that budget. If what you're intending to use as match of tribal staff time isn't in there to manage this project, then it doesn't count. So very important to think about that. And what we ask is that you develop 2 budgets. Okay, one is the abbreviated line item budget in standard form 424C construction budget format, which has about 12 different line items. And then the detailed budget that shows all the nuances of the project and how the engineer developed the cost estimate. That kind of information is very important to document your estimated costs. So you have a construction cost of $175,000. That's one line item in your SF424C budget, but your engineer is going to have probably a couple of pages describing all the various elements that went into that $175,000 construction total cost. We need to see that design, that level of detail as well, but you don't put it in e-grants. What you put in e-grants is the SF424C budget format, and then you upload as attachments the detailed budget information. The budget narrative describes how the various elements of the budget implement the scope of work. Sometimes that's not real obvious. Other times it's really obvious with the project. But in cases where it's not obvious, this is absolutely critical. So we're asking everybody to include a budget narrative. It's actually required by our guidance, buried in some little checklist about providing documentation as you're preparing your sub-application. But it's not talked about a lot. It's not really explained. It doesn't have to be huge. Okay. Now, additional project application elements. These are the places where the advanced assistance really kicks in. The funding really kicks in to help you with your project application development. The decision-making process is simply the documented project scoping that you went through and how you did the community engagement. There's also the damage history, the property and facility data, engineering feasibility, cost effectiveness, and environmental and historic preservation. We'll quickly go through the slides associated with that.
So I just wanted to recap here a little bit about what Stephen's saying, and this is the project application element. So a lot of this you would develop during advanced assistance. So you don't have to have this when you apply for advanced assistance.
That's correct. Absolutely. So the scope of work for your advanced assistance sub-application should include that you're going to do all of this stuff in your advanced assistance sub-application. I think I need to make clear on that. What I'm talking about with this particular section, and I will be honest with you, I forgot about how do you prepare a sub-application for advanced assistance, so I will add that at the very end. So what I'm talking about with this particular section is you want to, this is the kind of stuff that you can be using your advanced assistance for developing your project sub-application. But as Brenna, thank you so much for pointing that out, this is for developing the sub-application for the actual advanced assistance sub-application, not the project sub-application. In the advanced assistance, you say you're going to be doing all of this stuff, but you don't have to have done that in order to apply for advanced assistance.
But in seeing what's required for a project application, you can kind of work back to see, okay, then what I'm going to put in my advanced assistance.
Exactly. Exactly. Okay, so damage history. As I mentioned earlier, this is oftentimes an element of a project sub-application that is inadequately developed and creates problems when the engineers at National Technical Review go to redo the BCA and review the BCA. So the damage history is really important. Next slide. And this is a place where the advanced assistance money can really help help you gather that data, okay? The property and facility data, this is critical for the damage frequency analysis, BCA module, and for the seismic module. Engineering feasibility documentation, the level of protection, what design standards are you using, what's your residual risk to the structure or the infrastructure facility after project implementation. As I noted, a 25-year design will reduce damages in a 50-year event, but for a 50-year event, there will be damages. Cost effectiveness, this has been a huge obstacle. So in your advanced assistance, with the funding provided by advanced assistance, you develop this benefit cost analysis. You develop a really solid one that shows that you have a benefit cost ratio for your project of 1-to-1 or greater. And that has to be done using FEMA approved methodology. If you don't submit a BCA, the project's disqualified. We've actually had that happen a couple of times here recently. So one of the purposes of advanced assistance was to make sure that wouldn't happen, that the sub-application you develop out of the Advanced Assistance project results in a project sub-application that contains a good BCA. Next slide. And this is the BCA modules, just some interesting things there. We've talked about some of this before. There's a variety of different modules. They do have to be used. Ecosystem services benefits can be included. For anything other than acquisitions of hazard-prone property, it's complicated, and recommend that whoever is doing the benefit cost analysis, that expert, would be the best person to develop how ecosystem services are incorporated into the benefit cost analysis. Next slide. Okay, again, must be accurate, sufficiently detailed. No documentation is required, by the way, if FEMA standard default values are used. So the documentation that you attach to the BCA has to come from credible sources. And just so that you know, the National Technical Review FEMA engineers or contracted FEMA engineers will rerun every single BCA. So the software run is incorporated, and they download it onto their computer, and they rerun it, and they decide whether they agree with it or not.
So if you put something in that BCA, let's say you're applying for a generator for a critical facility or something like that, and you put something in the BCA saying like 300 people are affected, where did you get that number from? If you don't have anything in your documentation that shows that, they will run that as 0.
Yep.
No documentation means they're going to put a 0 for what you put.
Okay. Again, we've talked a lot about this, the environmental planning and historic preservation. This just kind of recaps what we were talking about. There's a lot of things that you can do in the Advanced Assistance framework to develop really solid environmental documentation, even to the point of being able to fast-track a post-selection environmental review. I wanted to call your attention to something that there's special technical supplements for environmental historic preservation for acquisitions, flood elevation projects, and flood risk reduction. That includes stormwater management, green infrastructure, et cetera. Very, very detailed at that web link on which you will get with the slides. And the next slide shows another set of documents that let's see. These are some more technical, I apologize. These are some more technical assistance documents to help you with your scope of work development. I've just mentioned those because I think they're useful. There's also some job aids and the like to help with with flood diversion and storage, floodplain and stream restoration, and aquifer storage and recovery projects. They have very specific detailed ones. I believe I've included those in the resources section. So the whole idea is the quality application is what we want to see as the outcome of an advanced assistance project to develop a project sub-application. And it's involved. And we're committed to helping tribes in particular achieve a higher level of disaster resistance through mitigation. Our states have been very actively trying to help their local governments do this, and we feel that tribes have often, it's now time to really put the focus on trying to help the tribes.
All right, so now we're going to discuss the different types of resources we have available. Here is our main document, and it's called the HMA Guidance. This will go into different requirements, will go into different requirements such as what you need in an application, what type of benefit cost analysis, things like that you'll need to do. So it's really, it's very all-inclusive, so I really recommend reading through this. Here is our HMA Guidance Addendums, and this will have specific type of kind of how-tos for acquisitions, wildfire, safe rooms, reconstruction, and structure elevation. And it's limited to those. So if you aren't looking at something in that realm, it may not be helpful to you, but it's still a good resource to look through if that's something you're considering. And we also have some technical supplements at these web links you'll see here. We have EHPs, again, that's environmental and historic job aids and checklists at this below link. And the top link here is a scope of work examples and engineering studies, which is really a good thing to look through if you're kind of in the beginning stages and thinking, what is mine going to look like? What do I need to submit? What does an engineering study even look like? I would highly recommend you go to those websites. And there's also job aids for generators and other type of resilience projects. And here on our guidance, we also have job aids, and these are all sorts of specific type of projects and fact sheets that you can read into on different types of subjects, whether benefit cost analysis or things such as like acquisitions. So there's a whole bunch of them, 34. So I would highly recommend you look at these as well. So the best practices, here at this link is sample stories that are FEMA best practices, and these are kind of the success stories. You know, it's a great resource to look through when you're at the beginning of your project and seeing what can go right, how can this benefit the community, what is something like this that you put so much work in the front end and it may seem like nothing good's going to come out of it because you're working so hard. What's going to come out of it? And you can read these awesome stories that show you how the community's benefited and all this paperwork that you see at front, what it actually looks like in real life at the end. Last but not least, here is some other resources. The top one is our web page. Just has a little tidbits about our programs. Our eGrants one is the second. That's the web page for eGrants, and everyone will need this because it's an important resource to have, the eGrants Help Desk. We have some great folks that are very responsive there, so if you run into any problems on eGrants, they're the ones to call or email. They are really great. They try to work through any problem you may have, and I can't recommend them enough. Then we also have the BCA hotline, or excuse me, helpline. If you have any issues running your BCA, they're another great resource. And the feasibility and effectiveness helpline is the second to last one. Similar to kind of BCA, if you're looking at anything with engineering, if something's effective, you have a question, I would recommend reaching out to them as well. And our cost share guidance is the bottom document here. Anything you have in question about the cost share, about maybe what's eligible, what's not eligible to use for a cost share, I'd recommend you take a look at that. So in final here, we have a great email address that we monitor here at the region, and we get back to you within 3 days. Please email us. And by emailing this generic email here, we can send you out to the right person. So it's really important that you email this general one so we make sure that your question is being answered correctly.